Available now at whitepillbook.com. This episode is brought to you by Patriot Gold.
And there's nothing going on tonight. We could pay for the city light. Or maybe just get drunk and stay inside.
Good afternoon, Michael Malice here. Let that be your welcome for the next hour. We have with us an episode that I think people are going to be talking about for a long time. And let me break down what's happening here. I was doing a live stream to promote the White Pill, my new book, and someone jumped in with a super chat and they said they would love it if I could get Curtis Yarvin, aka Mencius Moldbug, his Substack is graymatter.substack.com, onto Dave Smith's show, Part of the Problem. And I go, wait a minute, let's have them both on my show, and we could have a discussion about anarchism and the pros and cons. And I emailed Curtis immediately afterwards, and I said, Curtis, would you like to debate Dave Smith? And I don't want to do a debate. We're going to do discussion. And I'll break it down in a second on my show. And Curtis said, I would absolutely love to. Who's Dave Smith? So he's a very failed.
It's me from out of it. It's really I've lost touch. You know, someone asked me a while ago, like 4 or 5 months ago, what do you think of Andrew Tate?
Curtis.
I'm stealing your show. I'm sorry.
Okay. And so let me explain to the guests who these people are. Curtis Yarvin, aka Mencius Moldbug, is the creator of the Red Pill. NRX is basically your baby. You're one of the big intellectual heavyweights on the new right. Dave Smith is a comedian, host of Part of the Problem, 1/3 Legion of Skanks, and is very heavily discussed as potentially the next presidential candidate for the Libertarian Party in the 2024 cycle. Now, Curtis, you're very well read in libertarian thought and history. So this isn't coming at it from like, you're all racist, you want poor people to starve. But I think would be fair to say
I was going to come at it from that point of view. That's where I wanted to go with this.
I think it's fair to say that you are a post-libertarian in the sense that you think that, sure, their critique is often correct, but their solutions are, fallacious. So as briefly as possible, and I know you like to be loquacious, can you just give like 2 or 3 issues you have with libertarianism and or anarchism as a political philosophy?
Well, it's libertarianism at its best, and I pretty much read all of Mises and Rothbard. They're amazing writers, especially Mises. And the problem with libertarianism for me is that it's a little like Newtonian physics, in that it's sort of correct in its own regime, but outside of this classical regime, it becomes visibly incorrect. Actually, it's incorrect everywhere, but normally you can ignore the extra term. And the extra term is the way I usually describe sort of the extra term in this is I say that a kind of a libertarian paradise is an unstable equilibrium, like a pencil standing on its point. And the thing that, libertarianism is essentially the rule of law and nothing else. And what makes the rule of law is extremely desirable, but what has to precede law is order. And so order is essentially the arbitrary force that violates the non-aggression policy, that principle that is needed to basically keep an unstable equilibrium at center. If you go back to the pencil standing on its point, you want to use as little force as possible to keep it standing upright, but you can never have zero force there. But if the pencil is on its side, then you need a lot of force to lift it up. And so, imagine, for example, what it would take to turn Venezuela today into a libertarian paradise, or Haiti today into a libertarian paradise.
Wait, can I interrupt? I got to ask you a question just as to clarification, not to argue.
Sure.
When you're saying paradise, do you mean paradise in the sense that it's going to be like a platonic ideal, or do you mean the sense that it's going to be problem-free?
It's certainly a platonic ideal, and one would imagine the platonic ideal as mostly problem-free. The problem, of course, is that if you define it as problem-free, then you have no way to deal with problems. And when you basically start with a political situation that is a very large problem, such as the situation in a very third world country like Venezuela, where authority is deeply distributed, not aggressive power, the power to violate libertarian norms is deeply distributed around the state. It is impossible to, even define whether certain forceful actors are state actors or non-state actors. And so you basically say, well, do I think that Venezuela could function under the rule of law as Mises and Rothbard envisioned it? Yes. But, does that end state define the means of getting there? No. Do the means of getting there transcend the ideal of the non-aggression principle and the rule of law? They do. So they're basically like essentially in a state of peace and order, the non-aggression principle is extremely sound. When you're outside a state of peace and order, when you're in a state of war and chaos, the thing, before precision balancing the pencil on its point, you just want to get the thing off its side. And imagine suddenly your telephone pole is, your pencil's the size of a telephone pole. And yet, even if it's the size of a telephone pole, there's this like beautiful libertarian observation that I could hold this telephone pole sized pencil on its point if I had a ladder and I was standing next to it just with my hand, because I would counteract even the slightest, movements. That's why you can hold a really heavy motorcycle up if you ride. And so you sort of imagine basically, when you say, okay, I have a theory that applies both, a theory of pencils that applies both when the pencil is on its side and when the pencil is standing up, is superior to a theory that applies only when the pencil is standing up. Basically, Newtonian physics is a special case of Einsteinian physics. And so...
Can I interject, Curtis? Because you left
I'm
a lot there.
I'm done with that one.
Okay.
I was eloquent, I admit, but
what I wanted to do, so one of the reasons I just want to clarify, one wants to be a discussion, not debate. First of all, I hate debates, but I think debates are unnecessarily antagonistic, and then instead of listening to each other and having communication of ideas and conceding points when necessary, it just becomes hostile and just posturing. So that's why I want this to be a discussion, not debate. Dave, he said a lot there. I think the biggest point I would take away is that libertarianism does not provide a good way to get from point A to point B, but I'm curious to hear your response to what he just said.
I think that. Well, look, if the argument is that libertarianism doesn't provide a great way to get from point A to point B, I don't know that I completely disagree with that. I think that is probably true for almost every dissident philosophy you could think of. That's kind of the big struggle that all of us have. We can talk about these ideas forever, but how exactly do we get from this situation that we're in into a not as awful situation, is a much bigger challenge. And whatever theory anyone might have on that, certainly no one's cracked the code yet, because we're still living in the situation that we're in now. I think that's a really interesting way to describe things. The analogy of Newtonian physics versus Einstein's physics. I don't exactly understand what the argument there is. I guess I would say the way I look at it is more like if you taking that the pole analogy or the pencil, I would look at it. It's almost more like a door stopper, where there's tremendous amount of force being exerted on one side to keep us in the situation that we're in right now. And the best thing we could do would be to relieve that force. It might bounce around a little bit, but then does tend to naturally find its equilibrium. I think there is a natural order to some degree that is tremendously suppressed by statism. I think this is kind of like Hoppe's insight, that basically the very nature of the state is going to be to always kind of interfere with the natural order. So I don't know, I agree with you that obviously there's a tremendous amount of say cultural problems in Venezuela that would make it very difficult to see how they become a libertarian society. But if we could just run the thought experiment, if Venezuela had a lot more liberty and the government policies were tremendously rolled back, I do believe that things would get much better in Venezuela. And I think this has been true in lots of, you could look at lots of areas all around the world where the less statism they have, the better things are.
What about Curtis's point that when you're dealing with a situation like Venezuela, the NAP is basically kind of incoherent and you don't know where to apply it or how?
Well, I don't exactly understand what you mean by that.
Can I give a different example?
Sure, go ahead, please.
Rwanda. So if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of people will agree that probably the best governed country in sub-Saharan Africa, possibly excluding South Africa, but possibly not, is Rwanda. I would certainly feel 50 times safer walking around in Kigali at night than Johannesburg. And when we look at what makes Rwanda exceptional in the third world sense, we cannot fail to notice that what makes it exceptional is it has an extremely strong state. It has an extremely strong state for one basic reason. There was a genocide. As a result of the genocide, essentially the international community, which normally has kind of a boner for strongmen, if you remember how Gaddafi passed, really almost a literal boner for strongmen, sort of felt guilty, and they made an exception, and they allowed the strongman Kagame to exist and to basically rule the country as a kind of Tutsi military dictatorship for 30 years. As a result, things are basically great. And so, moreover, when you're basically looking to not be aggressed against in Kigali versus Johannesburg, the chance of state aggression against you walking around there is fairly minimal, but the chance of private aggression, which is what crime is quite high in Johannesburg and quite low in Kigali. And so in this case, what we see basically, sort of when you're imagining the progress of Venezuela toward order, I don't want to compare you to a liberal, like that's like wrong, but I was having this discussion with this very irritating person named Ben Burgess a while ago, and
I know
and
Ben. I've had him.
you know
on my
Ben,
show.
you've been and somehow we got into this situation where he wanted me to admit that I was a racist, and we were comparing Haiti and Norway, and we were I was saying maybe it was Haiti and Iceland, and of course the big difference between these countries, it's latitude, right? And the like. And somehow I got him to actually defend the proposition that what Haiti, which is currently, he was pointing out that one of the successes of social democracy in Norway is their high minimum wage. And that's another difference between these two countries. And I actually got him to claim that a lot of problems in Haiti, which is currently, I believe, controlled by a warlord named Barbecue, is kind of the leading force currently in Haiti. Not making this up at all. Just
well, come on, wait, Curtis. In all fairness, hold on.
I got Ben Burgess. I got Ben Burgess. I got to finish my story. I just have one sentence to claim that what Haiti needed was a higher minimum wage, and so the like to be like Norway, and so my point, I had a point. I'm sorry, I'll stop digressing. My point is that sort of you don't want to be Ben Burgess in this story. And so when we basically say, okay, I need a political theory that basically doesn't say, okay, there's some like magic bean by which Venezuela gets from a state of like profound disorder to Singapore to libertarianism, then you're basically saying, okay, I know things work like in a Newtonian way, in a normal way, and there's like some weird stuff that happens when it goes really, really fast. But let's think only in terms of the Newtonian terms. But the thing is, the Einsteinian theory is actually like more correct in all cases. And when you don't think of that change as like a special case, when you have a model that still sees libertarianism as desirable, but also says that order comes before law, you've got a sort of more general theory that doesn't contradict any of the things that you believe.
Folks, your welcome is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Now, most of you listening right now are probably multitasking. Yep, while you're listening to us talk, you're probably also driving, cleaning, exercising, maybe grocery shopping. But if you're not in some kind of moving vehicle, there's something else you could be doing right now, which is getting an auto quote from Progressive Insurance. It's easy, and you could save money by doing it right from your phone. Drivers who save by switching Progressive save nearly $700 on average, and auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Discounts for having multiple vehicles in your policy, being a homeowner, and more. So just like your favorite podcast, Progressive will be with you 24/7, 365 days a year, so you're protected no matter what. Multitask right now. Quote your car insurance at Progressive.com to join the over 29 million drivers who trust Progressive, which is Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $698 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations. Folks, one of the greatest accomplishments of my life, I'm saying this completely non-ironically, is being an underwear model for Sheath underwear. I wear it every single day, and I love wearing it. What makes Sheath special from other underwear is they've got 2 pouches for both parts of your male anatomy. It keeps you cool in the summer and keeps you warm in the winter. Their stretchy fabric is made out of this moisture-wicking technology, keeps you nice and dry, you know where. If you know me, you know Sheath underwear. And here's the thing: if you go to sheathunderwear.com, use promo code Malice, you get 20% off today. You get inside my pants. That'll be a first. Sheathunderwear.com, promo code Malice for 20% off. They're the most comfortable underwear you've ever put in your body. Support the underwear that supports the show, and let them support you. Try it. It sounds weird. The first time I put them on, I'm like, what is this? And now I wear them literally every day. And I model for them because I'm such a hunk. Let's get back 2 more hunks, like Dave Smith and Curtis Yarvin. Let's get back to the show. I think something else that Curtis is speaking is kind of the Pinochet problem, right? Or Pinochet solution. Meaning, isn't it true that when you have these kind of chaotic countries, sometimes it is, in defiance of libertarian principles, beneficial to have that strong man come in and impose this kind of classical liberal order, just as Pinochet did in Chile at the expense of civil liberties and at the expense of many innocent people.
Oh, I lost you for a second there. Sorry, we missed the last little bit that you said.
And I was saying at the expense of civil liberties and the expense of many innocent people's lives.
Well, I mean, in the case of Pinochet, I mean, certainly I think it was better under Pinochet than it was before him. I don't know that that's necessarily a contradiction of libertarian principles. I think that the truth is that he imposed many libertarian principles, at least economically, and I think that probably some of his excesses with like some of the kind of violent shit that he did was unnecessary. At least I've heard that argued before. I don't know, exactly how true that is. But I would say that, yeah, I don't necessarily think that there are no state actions that could ever result in a better situation than there was prior to it. I mean, we could all kind of if we're just playing like what would have happened if, as I was just reading your book about the rise of the Soviets, and, if the provincial government in Russia had just murdered all the communists, with no fair trial or anything before they came to power, probably that would have ultimately been a lot better. But I don't see that as a contradiction of libertarianism. The point is going that it would have made things it would have given far more liberty to the Russian people if these communists had been taken out. Now, of course, I'm doing this in, with hindsight. It's hard to know this, at the time. I would say that, to Curtis's point, look, I think libertarianism is essentially the view that aggression against nonviolent people is immoral. That can come from private people or it can come from the government. And I think in a lot of these situations where there's tremendous violence in the culture, yeah, immediately you're probably looking for anything that stops the violence against innocent people. And in some cases, that might be a strong man in the government. In some cases, that might be strong men outside of the government who are just kind of bringing order. So I don't completely disagree with that, but that doesn't really contradict that the goal is still a lack of violence against innocent people, or a lack of the threat of violence against innocent people in a society. I will say, by the way, I just feel like I have to mention that I've done several shows with Ben Burgess, and I like the guy. I do think probably that he's a lefty, so it's impossible for him to just admit that there are fundamental differences between Haiti and Sweden, or whatever the example was. So that's like the kryptonite of leftists, to ever admit that there could be anything.
All in the latitude. It's like latitude.
But let me ask Dave. Let me ask you.
So that's kind of silly, but I didn't see that debate. But maybe I'll go check.
Let me ask a follow up based on what Chris was saying. But aren't you just admitting that the NAP is not a useful tool of action? Because if you're saying it's a good thing for the government to have gone in and killed those Bolsheviks before they did anything, isn't that a violation of the NAP right there?
Well, let me just be very clear. When I was saying that, I'm using like an example of, in hindsight, if this had happened. I'm not advocating we start killing people who might be reading Das Kapital or something like that, but Well, no, but the point there would be that, like, look, if you're saying that ultimately the end result would have been less of a violation of the non-aggression principle than before. That's the reason why it would have been good if the Bolshevik Revolution wasn't successful. So I don't think that's a contradiction in terms of like valuing the non-aggression principle, just making the point that, like, yeah, sometimes things get messy and that there can be examples where like a violation of the non-aggression principle might lead to less violations of it in the future. So my only point is that I don't think that contradicts libertarianism in theory. I think that's just kind of living in the real world and things are messy.
But it does
I would
contradict.
say,
Hold on a second. It does contradict in theory in this sense, because if you're saying that sometimes violating the non-aggression principle now will have benefits in the future, the conclusion logically is that sometimes we should violate the non-aggression principle.
Well, look, I was talking in an example working backward where we know that the people involved were like the most egregious violators of the non-aggression principle or up there in human history. So that's, you know what I'm saying? Like, that's kind of my point. Not necessarily that it wouldn't, again, that's why I said it would still be wrong to just start murdering people for their views.
What do you think, Curtis?
I'm tempted to tell a story that someone told me the first time I purchased a motorcycle. Now, as a parent, I haven't ridden a motorcycle in many years, but the story was told. I knew that I just wanted to be able to get around San Francisco and not have to park quickly in those long ago days before Uber, but I didn't really know what I wanted, and I made the mistake of suggesting to one of my motorcycle safety instructors, who of course rolled up on these, giant R1100 RSs, that maybe what I wanted was actually a scooter. And this guy looks at me as if, he'd previously not judged me as someone whose sexuality was in question, but now maybe he did. And he said, well, that's an interesting choice. The thing about a scooter, I mean, there's a lot of advantages to a scooter, but the real advantage is that you can fix anything that goes wrong with a scooter with one simple tool, which is a long chain. All you need is a chain about 15 feet long, and you attach one end of the chain to the scooter. Anything goes wrong with the scooter, yes, attach one end of the chain to the scooter, handlebars anywhere, kind of will do it really. And you walk out until the chain is completely taut, and then you drop that end of the chain and go get yourself a real bike. and the essentially, when you reach the point at which kind of the non-aggression principle, which is sort of like, I think that one of the reasons people are attracted to libertarianism, or I was attracted to libertarianism, is that it has a sort of stark beauty to it. It's a really beautiful way of thinking about power and political science, and it has like sort of almost like the sort of beauty of like Newton's laws. And when you read Rothbard, who really developed most of its intellectual substructure, of course Mises is kind of an even deeper layer in a way. You really sense the fundamentally like aesthetic quality of their work. And the reason I sort of became a post-libertarian was actually through Rothbard's, greatest student, Hans Hermann Hoppe, and who I've been, honored. I had breakfast with Hoppe once. Like, that was awesome. Like, Hoppe is great. And Hoppe wrote this little book called Democracy, the God That Failed. And it was sort of a revelation because, in a way, it offered a way out of the Plato's cave of the entirety of liberal thought, of which libertarianism is a part. And you sort of peeked out of this door into like classical European political science, in which Hume, for example, just kind of takes it for granted that, the 5 good emperors were the best government in human history, and, monarchy on balance generally works the best, and like, what are republics, some Swiss thing that is always quarreling, and so you sort of look out of this bubble of modernity which you previously somehow conceived to exceed the rest of history. And you're just like, wow, actually, the rest of history is actually a lot larger than the last 250 years.
Yeah.
And a lot more interesting. And there's actually nothing really in, okay, there's some new things in this sort of Enlightenment modern era. It's an amazing era, but like, you know, it could be reflected on from outside quite poorly. So, you know, the thing is, when you get back to, I feel like the question sort of that we're asking here when we introduce this kind of exceptional state, or as the great Carl Schmitt would say, state of exception into the libertarian model, suddenly we have this beautiful Ptolemaic model of the, and we introduce some epicycles. We're like, well, it's not a principle. It's like a principle integrated over time. You can violate the principle to sort of get more of the principle. And I'm like, wait, you know, this tool seemed really absolute and really clear, and it's not really absolute and clear anymore. And what would we be thinking about these issues if we weren't liberals? How did they feel about these kinds of questions in like 1750? Because, you know, they certainly thought about them then. And 1650, 1550, 1450, right? You know, and so that's not that the past is sort of automatically right, but there's this sort of feeling of like breaking out of like Plato's cave in that. And like that's sort of the feeling that I got from going from reading Mises and Rothbard to reading James Burnham's The Machiavellians, which is also from that same mid-century period. And I was like, oh, actually everything libertarians know is contained within the Italian elitists like Mosca and Pareto. And so that feeling was like, you know, it does not cause me to like deny the holiness of Rothbard and Mises. Like reading like Human Action is like a religious experience. It's amazing. Like everyone should do it. It's so beautiful, right? But like I think that much of it sort of stands kind of against collectivist liberalism in a way that sort of misses the truth that individualist and collectivist liberalism are both flavors of like liberalism. And so, for example, when we look at, say, Elizabethan political economy, which is totally mercantilist, which of course Mises and Rothbard aboard, we basically were like, okay, this should tell me why free trade has worked for certain countries in certain times in certain ways. And again, it should come out as kind of a more general theory that explain the attractions of Manchester School liberalism or libertarianism in our time. Does that make a certain amount of sense?
Yeah.
Come through?
Can I say one thing before you go on?
Sure.
I'm curious your thoughts. One of the things, and I want to piggyback on what Curtis said, one of the things I despise about contemporary liberalism, and which is something which is never stated explicitly, but is always in the background, is this idea that everyone in the past was stupid, and now all the smart people living now, and of course the person speaking happens to be one of those smart people, and it's really one of the dumbest subtexts of contemporary thought imaginable, and it's so absurd that they never really say it out loud, but it's there, and it's just like you think everyone from 200 years ago was just like functionally just completely Helen Keller. Dave, I want to hear your thoughts though to what Curtis was just saying.
Yeah, well, so I certainly agree with both of you guys on that. I think modern times are an absurdly egocentric period that we live in, that kind of has this attitude that basically all of human history was darkness. I mean, we literally call it the Dark Ages, and then all of a sudden there's this Enlightenment, but and then the kind of like left liberal version is like, and then we were still just racist, sexist till like 1960 something, and then basically humanity starts. And I completely agree with Curtis that one of the greatest services of Hoppe and that amazing book, Democracy, the God That Failed, is that it kind of allowed particularly libertarians to say like, no, you can actually interact with a much broader history and kind of like take what the benefits of all of that are, and also really view what the negatives of at least particularly the post-World War I, democratic order are. I would also point out that a couple years after Hoppe wrote that book, Tom Woods, who's a very successful author, very failed podcaster, He wrote the book. The title was How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization, which I think was also like very helpful for kind of the libertarian movement to break out of that kind of, like this very small Overton window where all you can think about is what's happened Enlightenment and post, and realize that actually a lot of the things, even the best things of the Enlightenment period, were built for hundreds of years before that. So I agree with all of that. I think that the Misesian kind of laws of economics, I do not think are Newtonian physics. I think that they apply everywhere that human beings trade and act and work with each other, and that there are like the kind of basic Misesian understanding that economic laws are going to exist whether you choose to address them or not, is something that is going to that is going to exist in every single society. Now, there might be different cultures, some much more primitive than others, some probably will never achieve the heights that others will achieve, but that reality, I think, is still very important. And I would hope people who have read his work still kind of like understand the value of that realization. I don't know, there were several other things that Curtis mentioned there, so I'll try. It's really cool that you had breakfast with Hoppe. I was invited to Hoppe's his thing, what I forget what it's called, PF,
Freedom and Property Society.
Yes, I was invited to that in Turkey last year, and my wife, I mean, I got invited a few months before, but my wife was like 7 or 8 months pregnant by the time it happened, and I was like really trying to negotiate with myself to find a way to make it okay for me to go to Turkey while my wife was 8 months pregnant.
Well, I do want to point out that, as Dave knows, I did go to meet Hoppe in Turkey, and he did an episode of the show, which is available on YouTube. And I did get him to sign his book to Michael, I Like You Better Than Tom, the aforementioned Tom Woods.
I swear to God, I was going to go and try to get him to sign I Like You Better Than Michael Malice.
This is like Stalin picking like the leader of the U.S. Communist Party. Let me comment on the economic laws for a moment. I fully hopefully we can just keep this a love fest, unlike my my episode with Cenk Uygur. And the
I did see
I really had fun with Cenk, and the Cenk, if you're out there, like, I love you. Let's do it again. I love your work, and Ataturk. I love Ataturk, and so I basically I'm a very like strong Misesian and like Austrian extremist, especially when it comes to finance and little things like maturity, transformation, and what the hell is banking. This all is like extreme greatness. There's a wonderful book, however, by what's his name? Friedrich List, called The National System of Political Economy. And List reinvented, or essentially, people describe him as a mercantilist, but mercantilism had long been eclipsed by the work of Adam Smith. He was really a neo mercantilist, and he invented the industrial policy that basically built sort of the strength of Germany in the second half of the 19th century, when Germany was essentially the China of his age. Unfortunately, this happened like after, he died penniless, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you read List's work, it's very witty, it's wonderful, it's excellent reading. And one of the things that he does is he does the same Newtonian Einsteinian thing. He's like, Adam Smith is right about everything, as long as you're using Adam Smith's assumptions. And as soon as you violate Adam Smith's assumptions, Adam Smith becomes wrong. But, essentially, it's like in normal space, Adam Smith is right. But in like, if you assume like Riemann geometry, Adam Smith is wrong. However, we actually happen to live in Riemann geometry. And if you essentially start with the assumption that there's no such thing as a country, or that then sort of in a certain sense, which, I could go deeper into, but I don't know if we want to go down this rat hole, then Adam Smith is completely right. But if you model a country as a firm which owns its people, then suddenly Adam Smith becomes wrong, in the sense that, again, it's like Newtonian. And outside of that Newtonian regime, Adam Smith can be very, very wrong. And so, for example, one of the things, I had an interesting experience about 10 years ago where I was having dinner with this Chinese guy, and he was a grad student at Berkeley. He'd actually gone to college in China. I think he was pretty party connected. And we started talking about trade, and specifically about, I mentioned Friedrich List. And he was like, "Oh, you know Friedrich List?" Because this is not an economist. This school is even less taught than Austrian economics in modern. It's basically, at least Austrian economics is another kind of liberal economics. This is illiberal economics. And so, basically, I had thought that the Asian world was just simply, they just reinvented these principles spontaneously. Oh, no. They've been reading Friedrich List. And so essentially, when you basically look, the tree should be known by its fruit. And when you basically look at the attempts of applying liberal economics to trans-Pacific trade, and you see objectively that you're seeing the destruction of the productive capacity of the United States, and basically a concentration of ownership of this capacity in China. Worrying about that doesn't make sense from the Adam Smith perspective. From the Adam Smith perspective, consumers are getting their cheap plastic crap, so why does it matter where it comes from? It should be the cheapest. However, if you basically add the term of like a nation is something, a national interest is something, if you add basically the nation is firm into this, then suddenly like the Einsteinian term starts to dominate, and Adam Smith becomes really extremely wrong. So, for example, I think that one of the things that's cost the Libertarian Party something is that it doesn't really have the language to articulate what globalization has done to most of the United States. Whereas if you basically drive around the middle of the United States, you see these like ruins that are the result of some government policy in the last 25 years. If you basically have a system of political and economic ideology that says we need more of that, rather than what the hell happened, can we think about this logically, it seems ipso facto a destructive mistake. What ideology caused this destructive mistake? Again, we have, I think, a more sort of powerful intellectual basis for attacking sort of the current regime. And I think a lot of the aesthetic of libertarianism just sort of comes from this just like viscerally correct disgust with the way Washington works, and sort of this like desire to kind of, replace it with nothing in a way. And that keeps running up against the reality that nature abhors a vacuum. And like, it's sort of without a strategy for sort of filling this vacuum by replacing one form of power with another, it's sort of like the theory just isn't kind of general or realistic enough. And it often leads to sort of weird reverse direction things where it's sort of looking at a problem like the destruction of the heartland due to globalization and basically being like, you need to do this longer and harder for some reason.
Let me interject here, because that's a very fair and common critique of libertarianism, meaning like, look, how is someone in Ohio who's trying to feed his family working in a factory possibly able to compete with someone in China who's working at pennies on the dollar? There's no model, the argument goes, within libertarianism for that steel town or whatever to survive in the face of globalization.
Yeah, well, I would just say, let me address that, but just to say that I think the idea that libertarians kind of have this disgust impulse toward what's going on in Washington and think, oh, this is so corrupt, so let's replace it with nothing, might be fair to describe some very, I don't know. It might be fair to describe some libertarians. I certainly don't think it's fair to describe like Hans Hermann Hoppe as that's the extent of how he views the situation. I think that's probably point one that he would say, like, that this is disgusting and it's horrible. But there's also kind of like just insights to the nature of the way government works. The argument isn't that we should replace it with nothing because this one is so bad. The argument is more like, look, by its very nature, the government is by compulsion taking from one group to give to another, and by its very nature, you're going to be taking from someone who you think has something good and giving it to someone who you think has something not good, and that is going to inherently disincentivize the good and incentivize the bad. And you can apply this to almost anything that government does, and that's kind of the problem with the nature of the state. Now,
Can I
well,
try-
hold on, let me just talk a little bit, because you went on quite a thing.
Yeah.
But I want you to respond
No,
to
go
this.
ahead,
I just
Dave,
want-
please. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, so I think that there's no matter what you apply this to in the realm of where the state exists, you're going to find that it's incentivizing the worst behavior and disincentivizing the best behavior. And it's not really, the argument isn't that like we get rid of government and then there's this power vacuum. The idea is like we get rid of government and then there's property owners. And so we can kind of get into that a little bit more if you want to. Now, in terms of like the deindustrialization of America, I mean, it's been absolutely horrible. I think there's no question. And I think people who, drive through the country. I mean, my father-in-law is a trucker, and he talks about this all the time. Used to drive through these towns where there was nothing but production going on, and now there's nothing. I don't think that can be laid at the feet of free trade. I think there's a lot of things going on. The hyper regulation of the economy, the fact that we have really, like, almost every government policy has made it more and more expensive to produce in this country. It takes a lot to get companies to actually want to relocate halfway around the world. It's not just the fact that trade was opened up. There's a lot of other things that go into that. And I don't think conceptualizing the state as a big firm that owns all of its people, I think there's a lot of problems with that. There's obvious differences between firms and a state that just claims to own 300 million people or whatever size firm we're talking about here. And that when you talk about the national interest, this is a very tricky term. There are a lot of policies that are in different groups' interests. There's a lot of policies that are in the general interest of most people. When we talk about the national interest, it almost always in practice ends up being what's in the interest of a small group of connected people rather than what's in the interest of the general population. And for example, look, I get the point you're making, and I don't think that libertarians should be unconcerned about it or wave that away. But when you talk about kind of cheap Chinese plastic stuff or something like that, I mean, we shouldn't ignore the benefits of free trade. We shouldn't ignore the fact that look, there might be stores like Walmart or something like that put mom and pop stores out of business and lead to less production, in certain areas. But they also cut the costs of clothing in the most impoverished areas in America by large margins.
Dave, I want to let you talk about what Curtis just had to say. Before we get to that, let me pay the bills, because I want to tell you that BlackRock is warning to prepare for a recession unlike any other. And history has shown the only way the Fed can fight inflation is with a recession. And everyone's New Year's resolution is to buy gold and silver. Over 80% of retirees are concerned about inflation and very concerned about the stock market. In 2008, the stock market and housing market crashed. Meanwhile, gold went from $800 an ounce to $1,600 an ounce over the next 2.5 years. And big banks and billionaires agree on two things. One, we're headed toward a recession. Food prices are going through the roof. Energy, people are getting laid off left and right. And two, investors need to buy gold, which several analysts are predicting will hit all-time highs. And the Patriot Gold Group is introducing the 2023 Recession Protection No Fee for Life IRA. So call the Patriot Gold Group today before it's too late, and you'll get the best-in-class service from Patriots protecting Patriots. Patriot Gold Group has the No Fee for Life IRA, where your IRA or 401k can be in physical gold and silver, and you may be eligible for the No Fee for Life IRA on qualifying rollovers. So call 888-505-9845 to get a free investor guide today. Mention my name, Michael Malice, or go to patriotgoldgroup.com/p/Michael-Malice. Patriot Gold Group is Consumer Affairs' top-rated gold IRA dealer 6 years in a row. So call 888-505-9845 or go to patriotgoldgroup.com/p/Michael-Malice.
This is Walk-Ins Welcome with Bridget Pettisy.
I love hearing people's stories of resilience and grit. This is why I created this podcast.
We are very excited to welcome Jim Gaffigan, Yasmin Mohammed, Glenn Beck, Tim Dillon, Abigail Schreier, Jeff Garland, Ayan Hirsi Ali, Sam Harris, Heather Hying, Jonah Goldberg, Ben Shapiro, Glenn Greenwald, Sarah Shahi, Colin Quinn.
If there's a culture of victimhood, then let's tell stories of grit and survival.
Subscribe and listen now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Cheaper consumer goods for struggling people is not nothing. So I would just kind of say all of that. So
Curtis, your thoughts, please.
Yeah, a couple of interesting points. I think one of the I feel like this dogmatic sort of definition of what is or is not a government policy or government action or sort of the big state deserves examination in a way, because that definition seems somewhat arbitrary. You must know the Robert Nozick, the great libertarian philosopher who
God,
wrote
he's the
Anarchy, State, and
worst. The
Utopia.
great. He's literally the worst.
You hate him, Michael?
He's
You hate him?
literally the worst. Listen,
You've had personal interactions with the great
if
Mr. Nozick?
someone tells you that scientist X is the most beloved scientist among all academics, doesn't that tell you that this person should be set on fire?
No,
and
I never met the guy. He
No, I'm
never
not saying
broached his
you. I'm saying
project to
Robert
me. I'm not
Nozick
sure
is
what
in
happened to it.
Robert Nozick in academia is almost universally regarded as like the best that libertarians have to offer, and that in and of itself should tell you that he should be exhumed, burnt,
Yeah.
and his
Well, see,
family.
this is my problem with Hayek. But the point is, I'm just praising one pretty. Hayek is vastly inferior to Mises, in my opinion. But
No
do you agree?
100% agreed. 100% agreed.
You know what
and-
Rand
and-
said? Real poison.
Hayek
Yeah.
is the most overrated libertarian thinker.
Absolutely.
Besides
Thankfully,
Tom.
we could agree. We could agree on something. Isn't he a neo-Confederate? I love the Confederacy. But the in any
He is-
case, here's a thought experiment about so Nozick wrote this thing called Tale of a Slave, and the point of Tale of a Slave is you can't even define what slavery is. You can't define. He's basically like, we're going to go through these 10 steps, and at some point, clearly at step 0, dude is a slave, and at step 10, he's not a slave. And at what point does he gain his freedom? And you look at this and you can't say. And so, frickin' brilliant. Again, sort of a generalization of kind of the sort of non-aggression principle, which of course is against slavery, but what isn't even slavery? What is aggression? What is the government? Right. So suppose here we do a thing where we basically say, okay, you're a recipient of government benefits under the present system of government. We're going to wind this down, not in the orthodox libertarian way by basically just turning everything off, but in an unorthodox way, which sort of is kind of an extension, kind of an Einsteinian generalization of libertarianism. If you are, for example, earning a benefit stream from Social Security, we're going to convert this into an annuity, which is simply basically built out of government bonds. You're going to hold this bond. That way, that stupid Supreme Court decision saying you don't have a right to your Social Security, benefits goes away. No one can basically jack you around politically about this bond payment that you're due to receive. Even better, your securitized Social Security income, which has been turned into an annuity, that annuity can be sold for cash right now. So you basically say, okay, here's my insurance information. Here's my Social Security benefits. I'm going to sell them all and have no government benefits and instead just a pile of cash. Now, if we make that change to the present situation, does society become sort of more or less libertarian? We're not actually taking anything away from anyone. We're actually making their benefits more secure. So we're not taking their benefits. At the same time, there's a sense that basically what was sort of wrong about this benefit stream was that it was basically a vote buying scheme in disguise, as of course so many democratic things are. And by basically saying, now this is your money, we can't take it away from you, you basically cut that political cord and made it no longer a vote buying scheme. So, what is your perception of like this way of kind of winding down the vast kind of crossing payment streams that is the US government? Would that be a libertarian measure or like a non-libertarian measure?
Let's hear it,
Well,
Mr. Yang.
Well, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know whether that would be libertarian or not. I'd have to think about that a little bit. It's not libertarian, but I don't know that it's necessarily anti-libertarian. You're working within an anti-libertarian framework, and if it could bring you more in that direction, I don't know. I'd have a lot of concerns about that. I mean, the problem with that is that I'd imagine a large portion of people are going to cash those in right away. And so what's the mechanism for paying that? Just money printing and direct payments to people?
One way that in my sort of
Because you might
version-
see, just to my point,
Yeah.
you might see, I mean, if you think the inflation of the last couple years is bad, if you let everybody just cash in their Social Security and the mechanism for paying that was just the Fed printing money and direct payments, handing it out to them, you might be looking at an inflation rate of 30%.
Well, two things. One is that, sort of as an Orthodox Austrian, it's not so much that I don't believe in soft currency. I basically view soft currency as government equity. So the thing is that there's kind of a difference when you view literally a Federal Reserve note as essentially stock in the United States government. You basically sort of get the right impression of how to handle that stock from how corporations handle their stock. So corporations will issue large numbers of shares to basically cover like one-time events. Like if Apple buys Adobe, they'll issue like a shit ton of new Apple shares that will be covered by this purchase. So to the extent that you're sort of doing things on a one-time basis, that's very different from sort of becoming addicted to constantly issuing new shares and selling them, which is what dying companies do. Right. So in a sense, what you're talking about when you're sort of restructuring these payment streams is exactly that. You're restructuring them like in a bankruptcy. This is one of the advantages of treating the federal government as a firm, is you immediately have all these sort of tools. And so you basically say, okay, we are creating new shares to basically cover these liabilities that were not previously recognized. We did not previously recognize that all of these coming Social Security payments were actual payments. We are therefore going to account for them by creating dollars or bonds, which are just what we call in Silicon Valley restricted stock. A bond is just a dollar that matures later in life. So this whole structure of like the Fed and the Treasury is just sort of this artificial and fake thing. And so essentially when you're restructuring this system, okay, yeah, by allowing people to sort of pull future payments into the present, you basically make them, there's a term that sometimes used is N-word riche. The N is for nouveau. And the
that is not what I was thinking.
And
Can you please refrain from speaking French on my show?
Sorry, I'm still perfecting that line. And so you get a lot of people that become nouveau riche, right? And that's what really drives inflation. It's that these motherfuckers spend, right? And sorry. I'm not normally this amused by myself, but
I'm starting to think Ben Burgess was right.
About Haiti or Norway, really what he, I should have argued is that Norway should actually be ruled by a warlord named Barbecue, but in any case, and maybe one day it will be, and the inshallah, anyway, where were we? So yeah, that was kind of my answer to, again, like when you're started using these kind of more Einsteinian frameworks, the kind of libertarian framework of like what does a dollar even mean? Well, in a country where a dollar is hard currency, like that means one thing, and that's sort of one set of rules. But in a world where you're actually in the world of this deranged fiat currency experiment that has been a disaster every time in history it's been tried, you're still in that world, and you're still basically have to operate in that Einsteinian, in that very, very non-libertarian.
So I think the heart of the difference between the way we see this is that you see libertarianism as Newtonian physics, but we're living in an Einsteinian world, whereas I see libertarianism as the actual laws, and we're pretending we're not in that world. Like, we're pretending that we're in a different world where we can just print up all this money and we can do all of these things. And look, there are different schemes that can be attempted within this world to which may bring us in a better direction back to the laws of economics, or might bring us in a direction further from them. But all of this stuff is still not changing the fact that, conceive of the money printing however you want to. Think of it as you know, a firm printing more stock, or issuing more stock or something like that. The fact is that it is going to have the same inflationary effect, and that's what we've been seeing for our entire lifetime. And I'm not even talking about like measuring inflation by the CPI, just the fact that the price of everything is always like completely going up. The boom bust cycle continues. It's always being caused, like all of this stuff. So if we were, even in your example of treating the American government like a firm, if we're really treating it like a firm and it's going through bankruptcy, I don't think the process in bankruptcy is usually like issue a lot more stock. It would probably,
it's almost exactly that in a bankruptcy, is issue a lot more stock, because you're basically saying that your debt in a bankruptcy, what you're doing is you're converting debts that can't be paid into equity that will basically deliver the same amount to everyone who is owed that debt.
Well, what you're gonna do is, in a bankruptcy, right? Is you're gonna sell off all of the assets that you have and pay back your creditors first, right? And your stockholders last.
Yeah, that's selling assets. There's plenty of companies that go bankrupt and keep operating through bankruptcy.
Sure.
And they're basically like, these are valuable. But the one thing that's generally done in a bankruptcy is this debt to equity conversion, where you basically say, okay, here are my fixed liabilities that I can't pay. And by converting this into equity, what we're going to say is that we don't know how much people will be able to get out of this thing, but everybody's going to get the same amount. And very often you cram down the existing equity holders, because generally you cram them down and be like, your existing equity is worthless because you were shareholders in this thing that failed.
Well, sure. And the law dictates that you have to pay off your lenders before you pay off your stockholders.
Yeah. So you have basically a seniority structure. So the thing is, what you're doing in a bankruptcy is almost kind of rationalizing a system that's sort of relatively insane. If you have a thing that can be operated at a profit, I mean, there's enormous value in the United States. Right. This is very, very valuable property. And I think it's being operated very, very poorly. And so, the sense of like, okay, it has a certain set of obligations. The fact that you held a T-bill rather than, a right to a social security benefit, that shouldn't affect basically your right to be paid. And so what we basically have to do is create a structure in which bondholders and social security benefit receivers and everyone who's sort of been promised money by this thing gets kind of the same amount. And that's sort of best done by creating a lot of equity, which is sort of the normal procedure in a bankruptcy. The alternative to this approach is basically, if you take the really orthodox Misesian approach and you basically say, okay, the Fed, let's say, the really orthodox Misesian thing to do would be to say the Fed can no longer create dollars. Like, we're going to freeze the money supply. Unfortunately, what happens if you freeze the money supply is it's sort of like saying, the last time this worked, and it genuinely worked, was in the crash of 1922. In the crash of 1922, financial inflation, prices dropped a lot. There was a huge deflationary shock, and the country was sort of physically healthy enough to absorb that shock. And so it was very painful, but it sort of could be recovered from. It's hard to know what would have happened if sort of full liquidation in Andrew Mellon style had been the policy in the Great Depression. That was not tried. Instead, the policy of financial inflation was tried. The last time there was a serious deflationary policy was, of course, Volckerism in and around 1980, in which sort of the merits of a somewhat Misesian policy were restored. And instead of interest rates going up to like almost 5% where they are now, Volcker took them up to 20%.
Yeah.
That was insane, right? And the thing is that what you've got is sort of the way I think about this process of decline is you've kind of got an underlying sort of health of the economy such that 20% interest rates or like 25% price drops, like you saw in 1922, are like running a marathon up a mountain, right? It's good for you to run marathons. It like you basically, as Mellon said, he's like liquidate everything, and all the like corrupt stuff will come tumbling down. The problem is with running marathons, it's good for you, but at a certain level, it's like if you tell your like 50-year-old dad, or your 80-year-old dad in Michael's case, to run, a marathon,
Wait. Of the three people here, who is the most who acts like a grandpa? Everything you do is just sitting people down and telling these rambling, meandering stories about how you have a bee tied to your belt because there was an onion at the time.
What? What the fuck is this dude even talking about?
I didn't even get that, but I loved it. I don't know
That was
why
the
I
style of
loved
the time.
that.
We
'Cause I
used to
don't
tie
know.
it
All right. I'll finish. I'll finish
yeah.
the story
Mr.
quickly.
Pinkerton.
Right, but the point is basically, even 5%. I don't know how our economy is standing. Our like ruin of an economy is standing even 5% interest rates, and I just like shit is going to hit the fan, and everyone knows it, and everyone is laying off stuff, and we've got like a Wile E. Coyote moment going on now.
Yeah, it is
but
pretty
but
crazy.
like it's become very, very unhealthy. And the point is that if you apply the Orthodox Austrian system, like you would get, I don't want to go into the details of the mechanisms and like the banking system, but you get like 120% interest rates if the Fed could no longer create money. It would be impossible to even measure. There would be cannibalism in the streets, dogs and cats living together, full Evil Dead, right? So the thing is that basically like that
can I get
versus
David
that is
here?
not a valid path because we're not cannibals here.
I don't
Okay,
know.
Dave,
I
let me hear it go.
I don't necessarily think that's right. I mean, there is some truth to the argument that essentially the Austrian insight, right, is that easy money is like heroin, and market interest rates are like the like detox. You know what I mean? Like you're kind of detoxing from this unhealthy binge that you've been on. But to your point, there is probably a point where you're such a heroin addict that detox
will kill you.
Detox might kill you.
Like that. We are like 2 orders of magnitude past that line. Is my point.
I'll tell you, I'm not sure that that's right. But by the way, I think it's interesting you invoke there's a great book called I believe it's called The Forgotten Depression of 1921 by James Grant, which goes over 22 was the year after, but I think it was a steeper decline than the stock market crash of 1929. The government it was under Harding.
Grant's interest rate observer,
Yeah, and basically government did nothing because all of the mechanisms of government intervention had just been set up. They hadn't even figured out how to use them yet. You're thinking this is only a few years after the creation of the Federal Reserve and the income tax and all of this. This is pre-New Deal, so there's no like and they just did nothing, and it just basically healed on its own. It was very painful for about a year.
Yeah, exactly. Right. You should read also Garrett Garrett's wonderful name, Garrett Garrett, The Bubble That Broke the World. I think 1933. He was a great financial journalist, early libertarian. He also wrote.
That wasn't his real name, and we don't know why he changed his name to Garrett Garrett. No one knows.
I know.
He could have picked anything else as a last name other than Garrett when he just
I know.
There's an extra R.
It feels like some kind of like gay prep school joke, but
let me just
like he lost like a drinking bet or something, right? That's.
But I think there is a case for optimism with the current situation. And of course, by the way, just to make the kind of point, which is the Misesian point for anyone who's not like familiar, that then in the crash of 1929, the government acts immediately and does all of this effort to like reinflate the bubble. Hoover, despite popular myths, was like a very interventionist president. Then FDR goes crazy, and it prolongs it to make it the worst depression in American history. Now, what I will say is that you're right that the fundamentals of the economy are so much more out of whack today than they ever were back then. I mean, the idea of like raising interest rates to what the market rates would be. I mean, no one knows exactly what they would be, but essentially,
you'd have like 100,
You'd have like
$1 trillion of liability tracing like $5 billion actual dollars.
Well, it's a price like any other price, right? So it's going to give you information. So the interest rate on money is the price of money, and it's going to the more the more savings that you have, interest rates will probably go very low. And the less savings and the more spending you have, interest rates will go very high. And yes, we have no savings and the highest spending in the history of the world. So where the rates will be. Well, let me just finish this point here. I will say the one thing that is kind of that is the other side of this is that for us to stomach like hard times right now, to stomach going through the detox in order to like get healthy, not be a heroin addict anymore. We are, despite all of the crazy debt and all of this stuff, we are, I mean, so much richer than the people who went through the crash of 1921 or the people who went through the Great Depression in 1929. It's hard to put into words. And so much of this wealth that we have today is not just in the fact of it's in the knowledge that human beings have. Like, short of an atom bomb dropping on every major city in America, you're still going to have engineers that know everything they know about modern engineering. You're still going to have like modern medicine and the doctors knowing everything they know and the equipment and all of these things. I think it probably would break the modern system. It would probably break the dollar and break kind of like this awful system that we're living under. But I gotta say, my guess is that it's amazing if you look at like some of these countries, even, and this is decades ago, but if you look at some of the countries that really like radically adopted more free markets, you look at Hong Kong or like, other examples, South Korea versus North Korea or something like that. It's amazing how quickly they rose to like skyscrapers from mud huts. It's pretty amazing. And I gotta say,
why they don't do it in Haiti. But I
gotta say, we're not Haiti. We're the United States of America, and I still think actually that kind of like Misesian shock, Austrian economics response to this. I think there's a really good chance that we would get through it and it wouldn't be cannibalism in the streets. And actually what it would be us feeling the pain right now, suffering through a really tough couple of years, and then being more healthy and on a better path than we've been on in a long, long time.
Gentlemen, we're running out of time. I'm sorry I have to cut this short because this is really exciting.
I had a great response.
Curtis, what was your favorite part of what Dave had to say during this episode?
What was my favorite part? I think the parts where he agreed with me, the parts where he showed that he'd done deep reading, where he'd read Hoppe, where he knew about the Panic of 1922 or 1921 as it actually was, and had read James Grant, and had wondered why Garrett is named Garrett. I think that, had tried to go to the Property and Freedom Society but been foiled by his pregnant wife. Yeah.
You are welcome.
All month long on Pluto TV, stream the biggest Tyler Perry movies free. Watch your favorites like Medea's Witness Protection and Medea's Big Happy Family. Join Tyler Perry as he goes on a couples retreat with Sharon Leal in Why Did I Get Married? Or Idris Elba and Gabrielle Union in the Tyler Perry directed film Daddy's Little Girls. Plus, Pluto TV has hundreds of channels with thousands more movies and TV shows. Available on live and on demand. Download the free Pluto TV app on all your favorite devices and start streaming now. Pluto TV. Drop in, watch free.